Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in to this first of a four-part lecture series on Marx after growth. My name's Sean O'Brien and I'm a research fellow at Birkbeck at the University of London. I work mainly on precarity and representation, on the literature and culture of the American century, and on Marxian reading methodologies. I've also published research in the fields of science fiction studies, black studies, and film studies. This four-part lecture series asks what the Marxian critique of political economy can tell us about the 21st century, an historical moment marked by deindustrialization, economic stagnation, growing labor superfluity, and a political landscape in which the figure of the worker, or the industrial waged worker, no longer occupies the sort of central space that it once did. In a sense, then, we're quite far from the world in which Marx lived and wrote, a world defined by the development of large-scale industry, a growing industrial working class concentrated in factories, and the rising power of the workers' movement. Since then, much has changed economically and politically, a fact made most visible perhaps in the collapse of actually existing socialism. But if the American political scientist Francis Fukuyama declared in the 1990s the end of history and the triumph of Western liberal democracy, exemplified for Fukuyama in the end of the Cold War and the globalization of the free market, recent decades have witnessed not only a series of devastating economic crises, but also a surge of popular interest in Marx and a renewed scholarly interest in the work of Marxist theory. And this return to Marx, I hope, gives humanities students and scholars the chance to read Marx's work with fresh eyes. I want to say thanks to Azad, Kashif, and the 87press for inviting me to do this lecture series. You can find the lectures on the 87's YouTube channel, and a transcript of each lecture will also be made available on their blog, The Hive. We'll post a lecture a month, give or take, over the course of the summer. The series will open with an overview of Marx's method and some of the core categories of his critique, before moving to consider theories of real abstraction, questions of geopolitical economy, and the history of the capitalist class relation. We'll explore the relationship between cycles of struggle and cycles of accumulation, concepts such as impersonal compulsion and form determination, and the difference between what has been called traditional or orthodox Marxism and a more esoteric reading of Marx that in the Anglo-American sphere has come to be known as value form theory. The idea behind the series was basically to offer a sort of public-facing, para-academic introduction to Marx for humanities students and scholars working in one facet or another of contemporary studies who might be familiar with Marxist literary or aesthetic theory, but haven't yet had a chance to actually engage much with Marx himself and the critique of political economy in particular. And so, over the course of the lectures, we'll tackle some pressing questions for people who work and study in the humanities and who are interested in a Marxism for the 21st century. For instance, what does the end of growth mean for the future of work? How should we think about the relationship between production and circulation historically, or in the present, the regularity of financial crisis? How might Marx's concept of a surplus population inform theories of racial blackness and anti-black racism? What insights might Marx's critique of value offer the feminist critique of social reproduction? And what does the decline of the workers' movement imply for an anti-capitalist politics today? To give you a sense of how I've come to Marx, I grew up in a former mining town in Atlantic Canada called Glace Bay, which sits on the east coast of Cape Breton Island in the province of Nova Scotia. Cape Breton has come to be known largely for its natural beauty, through the promotional work of its tourism industry in an attempt to fill the considerable gap left by the flight of manufacture and extractive trades. And its industrial history, I think, is instructive here. The island is now infamous for having the highest rates of unemployment and youth outward migration in Canada, but it was once a booming industrial centre, particularly in mining and steel production during the long period of industrial expansion under British and then US hegemony. Indeed, the fate of the Atlantic Canadian economy at the end of the 20th century was inexorably tied to these hegemonic cycles of accumulation and followed a global wave of deindustrialization as the capitalist world system underwent a sweeping process of financialization after 1973. In the early 20th century, the Dominion Steel and Coal Corporation was the largest employer in Canada. In this image, which you may have seen on the poster for the first lecture, you can see the Sydney steel plant, which used coal which was mined locally to create coke to fuel the blast furnaces for smelting iron ore. By Friday the 13th, 1967, a day that came to be known locally as Black Friday, Hawker Siddeley Canada, as it was then known, was struggling to keep afloat and announced it would be closing the Sydney steel plant. Both the steel and coal industries continued under government ownership, so slightly out of sync perhaps with the way in which these types of industries lived the final decades of their lives in other parts of the advanced capitalist core. But by the early 1990s, both industries were in trouble again and were permanently closed by the end of 2001. The island also used to be home to a militant labour movement that lives on primarily through its memorialisation in observances such as Davis Day, an annual day of remembrance that commemorates the life of William Davis, a striking miner gunned down by police during a rally near the town of New Waterford in 1925. The protest at which Davis was shot to death erupted in response to a decision by the mining company, at that point called the British Empire Steel and Coal Company, to shut off drinking water and electrical power to New Waterford following a series of escalating miner strikes. At the time, nearly a quarter of Canada's military was in Cape Breton to snuff out labour militancy. The final throes of this militant labour movement saw union members chain themselves to Via Rail train carriages after the Crown Corporation decided to terminate its rail service to Cape Breton in the 1990s, which labour leaders feared would further separate the population from the national economy and put the final nail in the coffin of industrial employment on the island. Sure enough, not long after the train whistles fell silent, the Cape Breton Development Corporation that had taken over the mines in 1968 closed its doors for good following the decommissioning of all of its mines in 2001, and the company's former headquarters in Glace Bay became a call centre. Service work is now one of the biggest sectors of employment on the island. As I mentioned above, deindustrialisation has also led to massive youth outward migration. Vast numbers of young people from Cape Breton now work in and around the oil sands project in Alberta. Sydney, the largest city on the island, had a population of over 30,000 in the decades following World War II. That number began to drop in the 1970s, and by the turn of the new millennium had declined by a third. So the island basically exhibits all the typical signs of Rust Belt degradation: economic stagnation, population decline, urban decay, and so on, although there have of course been a number of revitalization projects which have met with varying degrees of success. And like many other rural and post-industrial spaces in North America, an opioid epidemic of so-called hillbilly heroin swept across the island in the early years of the new millennium and continues to take a large toll on communities. Ashley Mackenzie's really brilliant debut film Werewolf from 2016 captures, I think, this social history of the present in its story about Blaise and Nessa, two recovering addicts scraping by in a largely informal economy, sort of somewhere between unemployment and service work, which are the only options on offer in the post-industrial region where economic growth has been especially slow and good work hard to find. The film is relevant here for several reasons, I think. Its recursive narrative structure, beginning and ending with Blaise's suicide, suggests a sense of impasse or blockage rather than any kind of development or growth. Its oblique close-ups only affirm this sense of suffocating constriction, isolation, and separation. Blaise and Nessa's exclusion from the wage, largely, indicates that they are mainly superfluous to the production process. Its focus on the gender politics of the couple form represents this situation in terms of reproductive crisis, and its setting against the backdrop of a former site of economic and political dynamism reminds us that this is a world historical scenario. Right, before we get dug in, I think it's useful as well to point out what this lecture series isn't going to do. It's not, for instance, a kind of Marxism 101. It's also not an introduction to or reading guide for Capital, many of which already exist. If you're looking for this sort of thing, I'd recommend Michael Heinrich's introduction to the 3 volumes of Capital. David Harvey's is the more popular reading guide, I presume, and I use an image from it below, but as many critics have pointed out, he gets some things very wrong in those companion books, particularly on the category of abstract labor, which really is fundamental to Marx's critique. So I definitely recommend Heinrich's over Harvey's. Finally, I'm not going to offer a survey or a kind of overview of contemporary Marxisms, though I will draw on work from a number of schools, including political Marxism, world systems theory, Marxist feminism, and the dissident Marxisms of communization theory and the German New Reading of Marx. Okay, I'm going to start with a note on method. So the subtitle of Capital is A Critique of Political Economy, and this word critique needs to be emphasized. Political economy is the historical term for what we now call economics, and this is the object of Marx's critique. Marx sets out not simply to question some of the theories or conclusions of political economy, but to criticize its very foundations, as well as the foundations of bourgeois society and capitalist class relations. It's also important to note that Marx analyzes the capitalist mode of production at what he describes as its ideal average. In other words, while Marx is very much aware of the fact that capitalism only ever exists in concrete historical forms, his analysis unfolds at an abstract level so as to examine the various elements of capitalism that must be present in any moment in its historical development in order for it to be capitalism. Marx's own method also needs to be distinguished from the traditional or orthodox Marxism that dominated for much of the late 19th and early 20th centuries and was largely a result of a series of simplifications, really, of Marx's ideas, first by Engels and then by Kautsky and Lenin, which did away with much of the critique of political economy in favor of a sort of worldview Marxism or scientific socialism. In contrast with the ideas of Marx's mature works, which include texts such as A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, the Grundrisse Notebooks, and the 3 volumes of Capital, this traditional Marxism emphasized the ideas mainly found in the Communist Manifesto, co-written with Engels, and especially those from Engels' own Anti-Düring. Much of the now quite rightly disparaged ideas of traditional Marxism can be traced to these texts, including the notion of false consciousness, a view of history unfolding in stages, a sort of teleological inevitability of communist revolution, and so on. But there are further important distinctions to be drawn between the orthodox approach and Marx's own understanding of categories such as labor, the state, and especially the value form, all of which contribute to a very different conception of communism. The lectures will draw on developments in the Marxian critique of value then, but also the theory of systematic dialectic associated most immediately with Chris Arthur, which rejects historicist interpretations of Marx in favor of a purely logical one that understands capital as a system which, quote, comprises a set of categories expressing the forms and relations embedded within the totality, its moments, as Arthur writes, although I'll place much more emphasis on the category of abstract labor in Marx's critique, the importance of which Arthur really does downplay in his New Dialectic. Finally, while Arthur's totality is a dynamic one, in other words, a moving totality, it's also a synchronic model of capital. Arthur writes, quote, since all moments of the whole exist synchronically, all movement must pertain to their reciprocal support and development. While this motion implies that moments become effective successively, the movement winds back into itself to form a circuit of reproduction of these moments by each other. Okay, so this emphasis on reproduction and the circuit of reproduction will prove crucial for an account of the capitalist class relation, about which more below. But capital as a moving totality is not only a synchronic system, as Marx insists in the culminating chapter of the first volume of Capital, where he outlines what he calls the general law of capitalist accumulation, according to which capital tends over time to undermine the very conditions of its own reproduction. Right. So, Marx's categories. Marx famously opens the first volume of Capital with the statement that, quote, the wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears as an immense collection of commodities. The individual commodity appears as its elementary form. Our investigation therefore begins with the analysis of the commodity. So, what's a commodity? Well, to start with, a commodity is a product or service that's bought and sold on the market on the basis that it satisfies someone's needs or wants. This useful characteristic of the commodity, Marx calls its use value. Simply put, quote, the usefulness of a thing makes it a use value. Okay, so you might buy a cup so that you can drink from it, or a bed in order to sleep in it. Use value is therefore comprised of a commodity's material characteristics. The shape and solidity of the cup, for instance, which allows it to hold and carry liquid. and so is a matter of its qualitative properties. Use values then, quote, constitute the material content of wealth in all societies, as Marx writes, whatever its social form may be. In the form of society to be considered here, they are also the material bearers of exchange value, end quote. In other words, a cup is a cup, whether it was made by a medieval craftsman or mass-produced in a factory. But where its social form in a feudal economy might be a tribute or a tithe, in a capitalist economy it is a commodity, which has both a use value and an exchange value. A commodity's exchange value then is its quantitative aspect. That is, what you can trade it for on the market. For one cup, perhaps you can get a pair of socks. The exchange value of a cup is thus a pair of socks, and vice versa. A pair of socks has an exchange value of a cup, or 4 knives, or a hat. A commodity indeed has many exchange values. So there's an equivalence here between a cup, a pair of socks, 4 knives, and a hat, insofar as they are all interchangeable amounts of something else. In other words, their exchange value must be a form of appearance, as Marx says, of a content distinguishable from it. What is this something else, this third thing, as Marx calls it, that the cup and the hat have in common? It cannot be a matter of the material properties, since it's precisely the abstraction from use value that renders these objects exchangeable, an abstraction that occurs at the moment of exchange. What's left when we abstract from the useful, concrete, material properties of a commodity? Well, what's left is that they are products of human labor, and not particular concrete acts of labor, cup making or hat stitching, but human labor in the abstract, as Marx puts it. Whenever we abstract from the use values of commodities in the act of exchange, Marx writes, quote, there is nothing left of them in each case but the same phantom-like objectivity. They are merely congealed quantities of homogeneous human labor, i.e. of human labor power expended without regard to the form of its expenditure. All these things now tell us is that human labor power has been expended to produce them. Human labor is accumulated in them. As crystals of this social substance, which is common to them all, they are values. So, the value of a commodity is not the measure of an individual's concrete particular labor, but human labor in the abstract, which is to say a sort of social average, or what Marx calls socially necessary labor time, which is the average time socially necessary to produce a given commodity. Labor in a capitalist economy therefore has a dual character. It is both concrete labor, or the particular form of labor that produces a cup, for instance, and abstract labor, or labor abstracted from its concrete particulars in the act of exchange. Marx notes that he was, quote, the first to point out and examine critically this twofold nature of labor contained in commodities, and states that, quote, this point is crucial to an understanding of political economy. So this category of abstract labor then is crucial in fact on several levels. It's distinct from the concrete particular activity of a given form of useful labor. It's purely social determination, abstracted from the material properties of a commodity's use value. Its existence is peculiar to capitalist society, and it is the source of value in a capitalist economy. Okay, so what's value then? To explain this mysterious thing called value, Marx famously uses the example of 20 yards of linen, which for the purposes of explication, he says are worth 1 coat. Here we're working with 2 commodities in isolation, linen and a coat, and it's entirely arbitrary or accidental which commodities we use for this thought experiment. So Marx talks about this in terms of the simple, isolated, and accidental form of value. Okay, so if 20 yards of linen are worth 1 coat, then the value of the linen is expressed in the form of a coat. The linen now has a value form distinct from its physical form as linen. The coat represents the value of the linen, which exists only as a relation between the 2 commodities. Marx writes, quote, in the expression of value of the linen, the coat represents a supranatural property, their value, which is something purely social. So in this simple expression of the value relation, there exists a relative form, the linen, and an equivalent form, the coat. In other words, the relative form of value, the linen, is valued in relation to the coat, which is therefore the equivalent form of value in this equation. The inverse is also true. So if you swap them around, you say the coat is worth 20 yards of linen, then the coat becomes the relative form and the linen the equivalent form of value. If we then expand this equation to consider, for instance, that 20 yards of linen are not only worth one coat, but also 10 pounds of tea or 2 ounces of gold, we now have an expanded form of value, which is nothing other than many simple forms of value considered together. Right, so if we invert this string of equations into what Marx calls the general form of value, we can then say that a coat, 10 pounds of tea, and 2 ounces of gold are all worth the same amount, represented here by the 20 yards of linen, which has now assumed the form of a general equivalent. And by social custom, Marx argues, the money form of value comes to assume the role of a universal equivalent, here represented by the 2 ounces of gold. In this manner, Marx is able to solve the mystery of how it is that things which are entirely different from each other in their material properties can somehow come to be exchanged as equals on the market. Okay, but there remains something rather strange about a commodity. On the one hand, a commodity, a table for instance, is a thing with material properties and subjective utility. It's made of wood, and there's a demand for it because it's useful to its owner to eat or write upon, or perhaps to just burn as firewood. In this, its use value, the table is, quote, an extremely obvious or trivial thing, as Marx writes, an ordinary, sensuous thing, perceptible to the senses and entirely lacking in mystery. But as soon as it emerges as a commodity, Marx continues, it changes into a thing that transcends sensuousness. It not only stands with its feet on the ground, but in relation to all other commodities, it stands on its head and evolves out of its wooden brain grotesque ideas. What could Marx possibly mean by this? A table standing on its head, sprouting grotesque ideas from a wooden brain. So this rather Gothic, poetic passage is in fact a dramatic and suggestive way of gesturing to what Marx calls the mystical or enigmatic character of the commodity form, which, Marx writes, arises from this form itself. He says, the equality of the kinds of human labor takes on a physical form in the equal objectivity of the products of labor as values. The measure of the expenditure of human labor power by its duration takes on the form of the magnitude of the value of the products of labor. And finally, the relationships between the producers, within which the social characteristics of their labors are manifested, take on the form of a social relation between the products of labor. The mysterious character of the commodity form consists, therefore, in the fact that the commodity reflects the social characteristics of men's own labor as objective characteristics of the products of labor themselves. So what we find in a capitalist society is a world in which relations between people are mediated by things. In other words, you have social relations between things and material relations between people. And it's in this section on the fetish character of the commodity and its secret that Marx explains that what distinguishes his critical approach from that of classical political economy is an attention to this form of value. He writes, political economy has indeed analyzed value and its magnitude, however incompletely, and has uncovered the content concealed within this form. But it has never once asked why the question, It has never once asked the question why this content has assumed that particular form, that is to say, why labor is expressed in value, and why the measurement of labor by its duration is expressed in the magnitude of the value of the product. These forms, which bear the unmistakable stamp of belonging to a social formation in which the process of production has mastery over man, instead of the opposite, appear to the political economist's bourgeois consciousness to be as much a self-evident and nature-imposed necessity as productive labor itself. Okay, let's move on to consider how these categories then interact synchronically and diachronically. The capitalist production process, Marx writes, is essentially and at the same time a process of accumulation. Capital accumulation refers to the process whereby profits are invested or reinvested in order to increase the monetary value of the initial capital, thereby increasing the total sum of capital. This is what Marx calls the general formula for capital, or MCM prime, where M stands for money, C for commodities, and M prime for money plus the surplus value generated in the transformation of money into commodities and back into money. So let's explore this general formula for capital a bit more. Marx distinguishes the terminal movement of selling commodities in order to buy other commodities, what he calls simple circulation, with the interminable process of transforming money into commodities for the purposes of generating surplus value. Quote, "The simple circulation of commodities, selling in order to buy, is a means to a final goal which lies outside circulation, namely the appropriation of use values, the satisfaction of needs. As against this, the circulation of money as capital is an end in itself, for the valorization of value takes place only within this constantly renewed movement. The movement of capital is therefore limitless." So the general formula for capital describes the movement of self-valorizing value, whereby monetary value congeals in the commodity form only on the condition that it be realized at a profit, which distinguishes the capitalist mode of production from simple commodity production. As Marx says, the act of selling in order to buy finds its measure and its goal in a process which lies outside it, namely consumption, the satisfaction of definite needs. But in buying in order to sell, on the contrary, the end and the beginning are the same, money or exchange value. And this very fact makes the movement an endless one. So unlike simple commodity circulation, which, quote, reaches its conclusion when the money brought in by the sale of one commodity is withdrawn again by the purchase of another, when engaging in MCM prime, the capitalist, quote, releases the money, but only with the cunning intention of getting it back again. The money, therefore, is not spent, it's merely advanced. Money, or rather the capital form of value, therefore appears as an autonomous entity that exists independent of human actors, a kind of automatic subject that moves of its own volition. Marx writes, "In simple circulation, the value of commodities attained at the most a form independent of their use values, i.e. the form of money. But now, in the circulation MCM, value suddenly presents itself as a self-moving substance which passes through a process of its own, and for which money and commodities are both mere forms." So how is it that capital can come to appear as an automatic subject, as Marx describes it? Marx lays out this problematic in terms of capital personified. He writes, "As the conscious bearer of this movement, the possessor of money becomes a capitalist. The objective content of the circulation we have been discussing, the valorization of value, is his subjective purpose, and it is only insofar as the appropriation of ever more wealth in the abstract is the sole driving force behind his operations that he functions as a capitalist, i.e. as capital personified and endowed with consciousness and a will. Use values must therefore never be treated as the immediate aim of the capitalist, nor must the profit on any single transaction. His aim is rather the unceasing movement of profit-making." So the late Moishe Postone is perhaps the preeminent theorist of value as a self-moving substance or automatic subject. In his kind of seminal work, Time, Labor, and Social Domination, he argues that, quote, "the historical subject analyzed by Marx consists of objectified relations, the subjective, objective, categorical forms characteristic of capitalism, whose substance is abstract labor, that is, the specific character of labor as a socially mediating activity in capitalism. Marx's subject, then, is abstract and cannot be identified with any social actors." So this theory of capital as a self-moving substance or as an automatic subject is going to be important across the lectures. But it's also important, I think, to point out, as Werner Baumfeld has argued, that in their tendency to read capital as a purely logical presentation of capitalist categories, value theoretical approaches such as Postone's risk becoming a kind of apolitical formalism, basically neglecting the fact that the production of surplus value depends on the historical emergence and reproduction of a relation of class antagonism, an antagonism based on the separation of the laborer from the means of subsistence through what's called proletarianization. Proletarianization, then, describes the process whereby the peasantry become formally free to sell their labor through their forcible release from serfdom. So we're talking here about a historical development, not a purely logical one. And this is central, of course, to capital accumulation and the reproduction of the capitalist class relation. So Marx describes this state of affairs as the separation of labor, capital, and landed property in the 1844 manuscripts, and as the separation of free labor from the objective conditions of its realization in the Grundrisse, and argues in Capital that such separation, quote, is clearly the result of a past historical development, the product of many economic revolutions, of the extinction of a whole series of older formations of social production. This process of separation, then, which deprives workers of the means of subsistence and renders them radically dependent on wage labor for survival, establishes the historical specificity of the modern proletariat and constitutes its functional distinction from that of earlier exploited classes. But it's equally the case that this condition of separation must be reaffirmed at every moment in order for the accumulation of capital to proceed. And this is Bonfeld's point, really. In other words, the capitalist and the laborer must meet time and again in the marketplace as each reproduces the other through their encounter. This is what Marx calls the reproduction of the capitalist class relation. So capital accumulation therefore constitutes an historically distinct mode of social reproduction, which is the reproduction of capital as a social relation. As Marx writes in the Grundrisse, quote, the result of the process of production and realization is, above all, the reproduction and new production of the relation of capital and labor itself, of capitalist and worker. In this diagram, really great diagram from the afterword to the first issue of Endnotes, it shows what is called in the French translation of capital the double moulinet, or double millstone. Pardon my poor French. The reproduction of capital covers the production and circulation of capital, that sphere, or what we discussed above as the general formula for capital. And so the other sphere, the reproduction of capital, covers the reproduction of labor power, covers the buying and selling of labor power, but also the consumption of commodities and other processes therein. So the worker and the capitalist meet in the marketplace, and the worker exchanges her labor for a wage in the capitalist production process, and then purchases the commodities necessary for her reproduction on the marketplace before returning to work. And this is how each pole of the capital-labor relation reproduces the other pole. Labor reproduces capital, and capital reproduces labor. And yet, as Marx famously argues in the kind of culminating chapter, in the section on the hidden abode, once we go into that, once we leave behind the noisy sphere of circulation, the very movement by which capital accumulates compromises the conditions of its own reproduction. And so Marx writes in the Grundrisse, quote, capital itself is the moving contradiction in that it presses to reduce labor time to a minimum, while it posits labor time on the other side as sole measure and source of wealth. Okay, so we're going to explore this contradiction a bit more. Marx calls this process the general law of capitalist accumulation, which charts the general movement of constant over variable capital as it is coded into the most basic movement of capital over time. And the kind of key passage on the labor side of this kind of contradictory movement is the following. The greater the social wealth, the functioning of capital, the extent and energy of its growth, and therefore also the greater the absolute mass of the proletariat and the productivity of its labor, the greater is the industrial reserve army. The same causes which develop the expansive power of capital also develop the labor power at its disposal. The relative mass of industrial reserve army thus increases with the potential energy of wealth. But the greater this reserve army in proportion to the active labor army, the greater is the mass of a consolidated surplus population, whose misery is in inverse ratio to the amount of torture it has to undergo in the form of labor. The more extensive, finally, the pauperized sections of the working class and the industrial reserve army, the greater is official pauperism. This is the absolute general law of capitalist accumulation. Okay, so how does this situation come about whereby labor is increasingly made superfluous to the production process, not only in the form of an industrial reserve army, but indeed in the form of a consolidated surplus population and even in the form of official pauperism? Okay, let's work through this a little bit. So capital works on the one hand to create as much available labor power as possible, and on the other to steadily decrease the amount of socially necessary labor time. This is Marx's theory of crisis, according to which rising productivity levels lead to diminishing rates of accumulation and ever slacker labor markets. But note here again how capital appears to act as an independent subject, how its action effectively takes place before anyone even shows up for work. Logically speaking, capital recalibrates the conditions for accumulation before exploitation as a technical feature of accumulation even begins. Through the real subsumption of labor, capital reduces the amount of labor time that is socially necessary for production. That is to say, right, you have a rise in productivity so as to reduce the labor costs involved in the production process and to produce commodities more cheaply, more of them faster and more cheaply. Decreasing socially necessary labor time, though, entails what Marx calls a rising organic composition of capital, which indexes, quote, the progressive decline in the variable capital in relation to the constant capital. What do all these terms mean? Well, the organic composition of capital measures the relation between the amount and value of constant capital, or plant and machinery, and variable capital, or waged labor, in the production process. So he talks about the technical composition of capital for purely the kind of technical amounts of each in the production process, and the value composition of capital as the valuation of each part of the production process, right? Constant and variable capital. And the organic composition is the technical, or the amount, and the value composition combined. All right. So a rising organic composition means an increase in constant over variable capital, or a displacement of necessary labor by the means of production. In other words, capital accumulation proceeds with more hardware and software relative to the number of workers on the job. So this concept that I mentioned above, real subsumption, has proven quite central, in fact, to the larger problem of tracking accumulation logically and historically. Spatial readings of subsumption in particular, as capitalist expansion from the factory perhaps into previously separate or semi-autonomous spheres of social life, have been especially influential in recent decades, particularly in the work of Italian post-Marxists. But subsumption is a contested term in Marxist theory. Marx inherits the concept of subsumption from the German idealists, for whom it denotes the process of cognitive abstraction through which the particular is brought into subordinate relation with the universal. For Marx, however, the material act of exchange presupposes an abstract universal value, as we saw above, right, to which particular concrete labor processes are subsumed. So, according to Marx, already existing labor processes are first formally subsumed in their pre-capitalist forms through the introduction of the wage. To produce surplus value under such conditions, capital must lengthen the working day beyond what is necessary for the reproduction of labor power, producing what Marx calls absolute surplus value. Driven by competition and limits to the working day, capital increases the productivity of labor, as we saw, via technological ratcheting, reducing the amount of socially necessary labor relative to surplus labor, producing what Marx calls relative surplus value. Real subsumption for Marx, then, describes the form determination of the capital-labor relation in anticipation of value. So it's not only that concrete labor is negated in the abstracting process by which labor becomes abstract labor, measured as socially necessary labor time. Through the domination of the money form and the mediations of the exchange relation, labor in fact becomes a form of value for capital, internal to its reproductive movement. What happens then when capital reaches a level of development at which labor, expelled from production, is unable to find its way back into the production process? So what happens when that double moulinet circuit of reproduction begins to sort of break apart? All right. So final section on the class relation. So the periodization of capital accumulation that I'll use in these lectures emphasizes the production of relative surplus value and structural shifts in the reproduction of the capitalist class relation, drawing in part on the work of the French ultra-left collective Theorie Communiste and its critical reception in the Anglophone communization journals Endnotes and Seek. For TC, Theorie Communiste, the development of the productive forces entails, quote, the integration of the reproduction of labor power in the cycle of accumulation. So that's the double moulinet. And so changes the nature of the opposition between capital and labor such that the two increasingly relate to each other internally. And it is this process of integration that grants the capital-labor relation its periodicity. So the integration of proletarian reproduction into the cycle of capital accumulation, TC argues, gives rise to a cycle of struggles in which proletarian antagonism takes the form of the affirmation of labor, which was to be liberated and socialized as the basis of communist society. So really here we can think about the history of the workers' movement and the official organs of the workers' movement, the class mass party sequence, the union, all these other sort of institutional forms, the basis for which was the affirmation of labor, which was meant to be the kind of basis of the future society to come. An essay on the history of the capitalist class relation published in Seek argues that, quote, by using TC's analysis as a point of critical departure, it might be possible to establish a periodization of the class relation by distinguishing phases of integration of the circuits of reproduction of capital and the proletariat, end quote. In this analysis, the capital-labor relation undergoes a decisive restructuring in the early 1970s, opening onto a new period in the history of capital in which labor increasingly finds itself expelled from the cycle of accumulation. As Endnotes writes, quote, it is no longer a reciprocal and cyclical relation in which the proletariat reproduces capital and capital reproduces the proletariat. Rather, the proletariat increasingly becomes that which is produced by capital without producing capital. So the long arc of capital accumulation then is characterized by a transition from integration to expulsion, as workers are first integrated into and then expelled from the production process en masse. And this movement from integration to expulsion grounds Marx's own account of the logical and historical trajectory of capital accumulation. Noting that capital's ability to absorb labor inputs contracts over time, Marx argues that capital accumulation, quote, constantly produces and produces in the direct ratio of its own energy and extent a relatively redundant population of laborers, i.e., a population of greater extent than suffices for the average needs of the self-expansion of capital, and therefore a surplus population. You can see in this diagram, also from Endnotes, the double moulinet effectively turned on its side here, K for capital, L for labor, and you can see that the reproductive process is actually flinging off surplus labor and surplus capital that's unable to find its way back into the circuit of reproduction. So we're going to explore this more in the final lecture on the history of the capitalist class relation, and in that lecture we'll think in detail about cycles of accumulation and cycles of struggle. We'll look critically at TC's thesis, its own periodizing model, and we'll also consider some of the relationships between the production of superfluity and the ascriptive process of racialization. But I want to finish on a sort of broader point about models of periodization that I'll draw on throughout the lectures. So if you look at the periodizing models that have proven influential in humanities scholarship in recent years, you'll find that many of them, in fact, rely on narratives of expansion and growth. This is true of any number of approaches that go under the headings of neoliberalization, globalization, financialization, or post-Fordism, each of which often suggests a renewal of economic dynamism in the years that followed the economic restructuring of the 1970s. Though, of course, this isn't always the case, right? It depends on who's using these categories in what way. But there is often a kind of unexamined presumption that what these categories name is a kind of triumph of capital, right? And an expansion, whether it's about the movement from the factory into social life, or the spread of the free market, or the commodification of all kinds of sort of semi-autonomous spheres, this kind of thing, right? And so in post-Marxist thought, for instance, the shift from Fordism to post-Fordism signals a period of capitalist expansion, since from this point of view, all forms of social activity are now productive for capital. That's the Italian post-Marxist theory of a social factory, and it's been kind of really influential in the humanities in the first 2 decades of the new millennium. Other Marxist critics, however, have characterized capital accumulation in the period following the post-war golden age in terms of pervasive economic decline. And these are the kinds of frameworks I'm going to draw on. I think most notable here is probably the economic historian Robert Brenner and his description of the transition from long boom to long downturn. So for Brenner, intercapitalist competition tends to produce global overproduction and overcapacity, exerting downward pressure on prices and lowering returns on capital investments. As a result, profitability declines, which in turn places downward pressure on wages and triggers rising unemployment rates. In Brenner's account, intercapitalist competition between the US, Germany, and Japan reached a point of saturation in the early 1970s, ushering in a protracted period of economic stagnation and contraction in the advanced capitalist countries. As a result, quote, between 1973 and the present, economic performance in the US, Western Europe, and Japan has, by every standard macroeconomic indicator, deteriorated business cycle by business cycle, decade by decade. So Brenner reminds us that capitalists are subject to competitive constraints that compel them to innovate, accumulate, and move from line to line in search of the highest returns. But over time, these same constraints tend to trap firms in stagnant lines, placing downward pressure on extant profit rates, and his account of the long downturn will be important in the lectures that follow. Right. That concludes the first of the series. We'll be back in a month or so with the second lecture, so look out for that, and thanks very much for listening.